Guys, today we are going to be taking a look at the rise of labor unions during the industrialization period of the late 1800s into the early 1900s, which is a component of the Gilded Age. So we've been talking about, the rise of the captains of industry, how these individuals like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and others were starting to build these kind of industrial empires. Each had their niche. Steel was growing, oil production, automobiles, railroads, transportation hubs, and financiers. There was a big technology boom and there was a large growth of urban development because of immigration. And so many of the captains of industry were obviously becoming very rich. But we were also starting to look at, as we call this the Gilded Age, what was happening underneath and looking at the conditions of the average laborer, who many of them were immigrants to the United States. And so many factory workers started to reflect on their working conditions. Many who worked in factories worked very long hours. Some industrial jobs demanded that they work every day, 7 days a week. But more on average, it was the average of 6 days a week. Most people got Sunday off for religious purposes. But even working, 6 or 7 days a week, they were working 12 or more hours a day. Really, on average, the average workday was about a 14-hour day with a 30-minute dinner break. So there wasn't even multiple meals. You got one meal break during your, 12 to 14-hour shift. And so to give you a little perspective there, I mean, that could be from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. That's a 14-hour day with one 30-minute break. So it was a long, kind of grueling day. And then when you think about the working conditions that many of the factory workers and industrialists found themselves working in at this time, they were dirty, they were poorly ventilated working environments, and oftentimes quite dangerous. I mean, if you take a look at the picture here of these children, these were coal miners. Coal mining was the highest paying job because it was the most dangerous job at this time. And it was also highly in demand as we needed coal for the production of steel. And so if you take a look at that statistic there under the dangerous conditions, an average of 675 laborers were killed in work-related accidents each week. And so, that's quite devastating when you really think about that number progressing over time. And there wasn't any workers' compensation at this time. There weren't any rights. If you got injured on the job and you weren't able to do your job, they didn't give you time off, and pay you, 75% of your salary or your hourly wages so that you could heal. You were just fired. Okay, and so oftentimes many factory workers, because they needed the income, worked when they were sick, worked when they were hurt, because they needed the income. And so, there wasn't, any, as I said, no workers' compensation, no, if you were injured on the job, there was no insurance, there was no care, no sense of responsibility by the industrial owner. And if you complained, you were also fired because there was someone there to replace your job. So there seemed to be very little that factory workers could do about their working conditions. And then we also talk about, the role for women and children. It's bad enough for men in these conditions, but women and children found themselves in even more difficult positions. Because of such low wages, everyone in a family who was able to work had to work. And even though there were age restrictions on who could be hired, most industrialists just kind of turned a blind eye. They just kind of turned the other way and would hire, children of all varying ages. At this time, most people didn't carry documentation. You didn't have a driver's license or anything to necessarily prove your age. They took you at your word. And so some children, young as 10 or 11 years old, would say that they were 15, which was the legal working age. But as you can see here, looking at the statistic, 20% of boys and 10% of girls under the age of 15 held full-time jobs, which meant that if they were working full-time, they were not going to school. Education wasn't a priority. Having money to keep a roof over their head and food in their belly was the priority. And there were children as young as 5 years old working alongside siblings or parents, trying to, again, provide childcare, to watch that 5-year-old, but to also earn an income. And when we talk about income, thinking about the low wages, oftentimes, children, for example, could work a 14-hour day. So again, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. and be paid 27 cents for that day. That's less than 2 cents an hour that they were being paid. On average, an example in 1899, talking about the discrepancy between women and men doing pretty much the same work, but women were paid essentially half. In 1899, women made on average about $267 for the year, where men were making on average about $498. Still really low wages, but even noticing that women are making less, considerably less, even though they're doing similar work. And just to give you another perspective, when we think about those captains of industry, that same year where the average for women was $267 and men was $498, Andrew Carnegie made $23 million that year. And so we see a large gap during this time period between the rich and the poor. So what can the workers do about this? How can they try to change their lives, change their working conditions, get better hours, get better wages? And this is where the birth of labor unions starts to come together. Skilled workers and unskilled workers, men and women, black and white, they all come together because they realize that they're stronger in numbers. If one person complains, that person's fired. Okay, 20 people complain, probably 20 people are fired. But if hundreds to thousands complain and take action, then they start to get somewhere. Then they have some leverage against these industrialist owners and captains of industry. And so we start to see, there were craft unions, there were small unions, small collections, but we don't start to see our first national unions until after the Civil War, which here we see the National Labor Union in 1866. So it kind of grouped some of those smaller craft unions and brought them together. So they're varying occupations, but again, with the collective goal of wanting to get better wages, better hours, and better working conditions. And so one of the big successes of the National Labor Union was in 1868, so just 2 years after their formation, they did persuade Congress to legalize an 8-hour workday for government workers. So that's not for everybody, right? This is, at this time, we are a capitalistic, well, still a capitalistic, but this is the birth of capitalism and private industry. And so industrial owners had the ability to determine their hours, but at least at the government level, the National Labor Union was able to secure an 8-hour workday, which was a big victory for them. And it's going to start to have people start thinking maybe labor unions are the way to go. 2 years later, we see the Knights of Labor formed. And so this one was open to all workers. Some of the earlier labor unions were for just skilled workers or workers of a particular trade. But Knights of Labor said, we're going to take all. We're going to take women, because a lot of labor unions would not accept female members. We would take in children. We would take in minorities, as the National Labor Union would not accept African American laborers. So the Knights of Labor was kind of opening their door to anybody, skilled, unskilled, didn't matter. And one of the things that they favored or called for was the role of arbitration. And so that was their means of trying to bring about change. Arbitration is kind of a private process where disputing parties agree that one or several individuals can make a decision about the dispute, receiving evidence and hearing arguments. So it's not quite a mediator. A mediator just leads and kind of facilitates a discussion between the two opposing parties. An arbitrator, during arbitration, actually can help settle the dispute. So it is a third party who comes in, hears the arguments of both sides. So in this case, would hear the arguments of the industrial owner versus the argument of their employees, the industrial workers, and try to reach some type of agreement. The other major labor union that we see established, which was established by Samuel Gompers, is the American Federation of Labor, also known as the AFL. And so this is established kind of in the heart of the Gilded Age and the rise of industrialization in 1886. Now, one unique thing about the American Federation of Labor is it was for only skilled workers. So Samuel Gompers and many others who supported the American Federation of Labor realized that skilled workers have the leverage. Finding an unskilled worker at this time was really easy. We had immigrants coming by the thousands a day who were going to, do whatever they could to make money. Where a skilled worker, meaning they are certified in their trade, they're harder to find. They are of more demand. If you lose your skilled workers, that is certainly going to impact your production. And so that's what many of the skilled workers start to realize. They use their certifications and their skills as leverage. And so they come together and they support a negotiation process called collective bargaining. And so collective bargaining is kind of where, essentially the employees, like they recognize the union. So members of the union represent the workers on behalf to the industrial owners to, again, try to negotiate particularly about wages and working conditions, to try to get a better, standard of working for the members of the union as a whole. So notice that these labor unions don't advocate strikes. Strikes are something that most people associate with labor unions, but most of these labor unions don't want to go that route, because strikes are, they're not stable. They're not a guaranteed approach. And so many of them are looking for peaceful means to try to improve their living conditions. And so we start to see other specific industry unions start to emerge. A prime example of that is the American Railway Union, created by Eugene V. Debs. Looking at railway workers. At first, the American Railway Union consisted primarily of unskilled laborers, and railroad builders, but eventually they are going to appeal to, the skilled engineers as well as the firemen who also worked along, in the railroad industry. And so, they start to collect, they start to come together. And Eugene V. Debs and many other industrialist leaders, or labor union leaders, I should say, at this time, also started to advocate for this idea of socialism. So socialism is an economic and political system based on government control of business and property and equal distribution of wealth. Oftentimes when people hear socialism, they automatically think communism. But communism is the extreme form of socialism. Eugene V. Debs wasn't calling for communism per se, but he was calling for more of that equal distribution of wealth, establishing a middle class, so that we didn't have such a discrepancy where we have, 1 to 2% of the population controlling 90% of the wealth in the nation. And recognizing that maybe the best way to get that equal distribution would be more government regulation and control of business, less private control, where these industrialists had the means to dictate what wages would be, how much items would be, how much would be on the market. So more government regulation. And, we can see where industrialists are going to find socialism, by industrialists, I should say, clarify, the industrial workers find socialism appealing. They see this as even footing, that maybe more wealth should be distributed to the masses, as they are the ones producing the products and doing the daily labor to be able to make these products. So socialism is going to start to emerge in the United States in the late 1800s. And Eugene V. Debs, we'll talk about him in the election of 1912. He's going to run for president with the Socialist Party, okay, as we start to see them emerge during that time. So even though many of these labor unions are trying to avoid strikes, sometimes strikes just have to happen. And these are 3 highly notable strikes during the Gilded Age. The first one here is the Haymarket Riot, also known as the Haymarket Affair. So in May of 1866, in Chicago, that's where Haymarket Square is, some workers and citizens had gathered. About 3,000 workers and citizens had gathered to protest police brutality. Just the day before, a striker had been killed, and several had been wounded at the McCormick Harvester plant, okay, because they were on strike for better working conditions. By that evening, rain was starting to fall, the police were starting to show up, even though protest is a right at, with the First Amendment. There were individuals, especially industrialists, who did not want to see strikes and protests start to break out. So by about 10 p.m., people are starting to disperse. It's starting to rain, especially as the police show up. However, as people are starting to disperse and leave, someone, and to this day we have no idea who it was, but someone tossed a bomb into the police line. And so police started to fire on the workers and the crowd who were there protesting. 7 police officers and several workers died in the chaos that followed. And so, as I said, they never knew who actually threw the bomb. However, government officials arrested 3 of the speakers at the demonstration. So 3 of the kind of keynote speakers for the protester rally, and 5 other radicals were charged with inciting a riot because they wanted to hold someone accountable for these actions. All 8 of them were convicted. Not a single one was found not guilty. 4 were hanged, and 1 committed suicide while in prison. And so this particular affair turned the public against labor unions. They felt that they were violent, that they would go to extreme measures, to the degree of throwing a bomb at the police to make their point. Meanwhile, in Homestead, Pennsylvania, at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills, another strike broke out known as the Homestead Strike. And so this was steel workers versus what we call scabs. Scabs are people who will work during a strike. Okay, so another name for them is a strike breaker. Those who are on strike oftentimes called them scabs, because if workers are willing to work while others on strike, it pretty much defeats the purpose of the strike, and those people are going to find themselves without a job. So many of the workers at the Homestead mill, the Homestead steel mill, were looking for higher wages, and so they were going on strike. Well, the manager of the mill decided to, hire Pinkerton detectives. So it was just like a private police force at this time. And they were to protect the gates of the mill and the factory so that these strike breakers could get in to be able to work, to be able to continue production. Fighting broke out between the Pinkerton detectives and those workers who were on strike, because they recognized if they got those strike breakers in there to work and production continued, they were pretty much out of a job. And so the steel workers actually forced the Pinkertons out, and they kept the plant closed. But eventually the Pennsylvania National Guard is going to be called in, and the strike is going to be broken up. The workers are not going to be successful. Andrew Carnegie did allow the strikers to have their jobs back. However, he cut their wages even further to send a message to not join labor unions. So you think about, the efforts of their strikers. They went on strike because their wages had gotten cut. And as a result of their strike, their wages got cut even further. But they were at least able to maintain their job, unlike many with the Pullman strike. And so the Pullman strike came about in the late 1800s, about 1894. Pullman, in 1893, there was an economic panic. We were going through an economic recession. And so during a time of recession, many companies start to lay off some of their employees and have to cut back on wages. And Pullman was no different. So the Pullman company had laid off more than 3,000 of their 5,800 employees. And of those employees who were able to keep their job, their wages got cut by 25 to even 50%. Now, the reason why this is an issue is under the Pullman industry is not that you were just a Pullman employee, but you were also lived in their housing. Now, that was one unique thing about the Pullman company is they created company housing. And so this is where the big issue is they cut their employees' wages or even fired those. So if you're fired, you can't live in company housing. So not only did you lose your job, you're also losing your home. But those who were able to keep their job had their wages cut, they didn't lower rent. And so they're having to still pay a high rent with lower wages. They're not bringing home enough money to be able to survive. So they decided to go on strike. And they did this in the spring of 1894 when the company failed to restore their wages or decided to decrease the rent. Um, the Pullman Company hired strikebreakers. The strike obviously turned violent, and eventually the president at this time, who was President Grover Cleveland, is going to intervene with federal troops. Um, Pullman, won. It was in favor of the industrialists and the industrialist company. Those who went on strike were fired, which means they're out of company housing. But also they were blacklisted. So they were put on a blacklist, meaning that they would not be hired by any other railroad company. Pullman, gave out a list to all the other industrialists saying, don't hire these workers. And so these three situations made for people not trusting labor unions or being fearful of being a member of a labor union. The first time that we actually see labor unions truly successful in making some national change was after a large tragedy, and it's not until the 20th century. So here we see the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which is going to turn into a fire. So shirtwaist is essentially, just your basic white cotton shirt, men, women, all would wear. So it's a textile mill in New York City. And at the time of this fire breaking out in 1911, the managers of the factory actually locked their workers in. So when they showed up, they were locked in. So if you weren't there, on time, you didn't work that day and most likely were going to be fired. But it also prevented the women from leaving, taking unnecessary breaks or leaving early. So they were locked in from the outside and only the managers had the key. Well, there weren't enough fire escapes. At this time, there weren't standards for fire escapes at certain windows. And so here, a fire did break out, and they were on, I do believe, the 23rd floor. And so women who were locked in had a choice. They could stay and potentially die in the fire, or they could jump from the windows and hope that they survive the fall to be able to escape the fire. And that was a grueling choice, to have to decide to make. And so many women did jump, and that's where we see here in the newspaper publication talking about women leaping to their death and, the women who had died who were there on the sidewalk. This got national news. People were appalled that women had to make this choice in terms of their working conditions. And so as a result of this particular incident, they're going to start to implement strict fire codes. People cannot be locked in. There have to be fire escapes at the windows. A 54-hour max work week for women and minors. And prohibiting work on Sundays to be able to give that day off, and no child labor, no labor by children under the age of 14, even though that's going to be hard to implement. So it took a tragedy to start to get and bring about some of this change in terms of working conditions. So what are the fates of the unions? Well, one thing that we can start to understand is employers are going to start to forbid them. They're going to, as they hire people, they're going to make them swear an oath that they will never join a labor union. They eventually get the federal government on their side with the Sherman Antitrust Act, turning them against labor unions. They will make a claim that these strikes or boycotts or interruptions in production create a problem with interstate trade. And so the federal government would intervene on the inside of the industrial owner, not on the labor unions. And so these legal limitations are going to cripple the early efforts of the labor unions. But membership is still going to start to rise. Obviously, there are setbacks after the Haymarket riot and the Homestead strike and the Pullman strike. But eventually, with victories, even small victories, people are going to start to turn to labor unions as their collective effort to fight back against the difficulties of the industrial age.